Okay, as Eugenia was just saying, hello everyone and welcome. And we'll switch now to a share screen and get seminar 5 underway. Except this time, when I did that, everything disappeared. I know. My apologies. All right, time to compose yourself before we start. Seminar 5, week 5. So this is the last one before the break. So we're going to touch on a lot of the things we've already touched on in a slightly new way, just to reiterate them, and then open up a couple of new avenues of inquiry, because the week off you'll have plenty of time to rest, meditate, think about stuff, chase up some issues, and come back anew. Now, we were talking last week about the the forgetting of the gods, what gets put in its place, something to do with the limit of the beautiful, says Lacan, something to do with the second death, something to do with what Sartre later calls crime. So I got here a quote across the top here from Bataille's Tears of Eros, 1961. This was his final work, and you can see it there on the right of your screen. That the Middle Ages assigned a place to eroticism in painting. It relegated it to hell. It could only figure as something condemned. So if you do a kind of a quick juxtaposition here of on the left here, you've got in the Hellenistic era Hades and Gaudi, or Hades and Persephone. Gaudi just means girl. Once she gets married to Hades, she becomes the queen of the underworld, Queen Persephone. And this is 336 BC, commissioned by Alexander for his father. And then compare that to the death and the maiden theme in the Middle Ages, which is one picture that Bataille puts in his Tears of Eros, to see how Hades has changed from a sort of fleshy, kind of vibrant, fulsome body to a decaying corpse. So any eroticism that could be there in Hades' position has been kind of subtracted. It's pretty gross. It's like, looks like decaying meat, right? And the maiden has some attractive features, but you see she's being turned into death as well. Then you switch across now to Bernini's Hades and Gaudi in 1622, where you see a kind of return, a renaissance, if you like, of the sort of more attractive, fleshy, erotic tones, the things that we normally find erotically appealing. And there's a slight detail of the detail on the fingers and the skin. I think Bernini's son called it the perfect balance of cruelty and tenderness, or something like that. Then just a couple of other examples of the death and the maiden theme from Hans Baldung, which show the sort of the different sort of skeleton, ghoulish characters. The eroticism may be there, but it's as something condemned, right? It's like, it's not something that you would think that you're going to like ordinarily fantasize about. So if you went on to, for example, top 10 performers on Pornhub, you're not going to find a decaying skeleton like that, right? It's not the sort of normal object of desire. The eroticism has been calumniated or cursed with the symbol of negation in some ways. Now, for all things Persephone, Alison Horbury's book on the Persephone complex is the one to consult, which tells a story about the separation of Persephone from her mother Demeter. You can see down the bottom here, on the bottom right, in terms of the Lacanian sort of trajectory, in sort of making a transition from the mother as the sort of prime object to some kind of a paternal substitute. But of course, it's not as if the mother has no say at all, because what's the famous part of the myth, of course, is that Demeter is so upset by this deal cut by Zeus and Hades for Persephone to be betrothed to Hades, that she basically starts to commit ecocide. Everything's going to die. Like she's in charge for like the spring regeneration of all the crops and plant life, and she's like, it's not going to happen until I get her back. And so that's how they cut that deal where Persephone spent some time with the mother, some time with Hades in the underworld, and that's supposed to be in some way represent the changing of the seasons, when Persephone goes down or when Persephone returns. Now, what's Lacan say in the Ethics Seminar 7? He says, as a rhetorical question, aren't Hades and Dionysus one and the same thing? That's on page 300. What else does he say? Hades, or Edis, means invisible. So if you think of the Edis there as the term for idea, and the alpha as the alpha privative, like we have in English for words like ahistorical or amoral, or what's another popular one? Those two will do. Or of course the one that Heidegger makes a big song and dance about, aletheia, which is actually the Greek word for truth, where lithy means concealment or hiddenness, and the river Lithi, and the alpha privative means not hidden or not concealed. So he talks about truth as a process of revealing. So here we've got Hades as unideated, unapprehended to the intellect, right? Invisible. But Lacan goes on. But Edeia can also mean the shameful parts. Or Edeia means the shameful parts, right? What's not visible are the shameful parts, as in what? The stuff we usually keep under clothes, right? The genitals. But it can also mean something respectable and venerable, which is a pretty good definition of the genitals, of the real. It's something that is in some ways shameful, but in the right moment, in the right sort of affirmed moment, it's also something venerable and sacred. Like we're talking here about divinities here engaging in these acts, in these sexual acts, right? What's Lacan say about shame? Cross-cut forward to Seminar 17. He says, it is impossible for the honest to die of shame. You know, for me, that this means the real. So, why? Because in order to re-access or re-reveal, if you like, our invisible parts, our sexual parts, we have to go through these sort of shame, these shame reactions and these anxiety reactions that are put in place by our normally functioning taboos. But it's impossible for the honest to die of shame, to die of the real. Why? Because they've already done the work of self-reflection and come to understand and integrate just what are these erotic functions. It's impossible to be shamed about your sexuality when you become honest about it, right? That means the work of the ethics of psychoanalysis. Back to page 300 of Seminar 7. At the end of one of his final papers, says Lacan, Analysis Terminable and Interminable, Freud tells us that in the end, the aspiration of the patient collapses into an ineradicable nostalgia for the fact that there is no way they can be the phallus. And that since they cannot be it, they can have it in the condition of penisnide in a woman, penis envy, or of castration in a man, castration anxiety. And this is why Freud thought psychoanalysis is one of the impossible professions, because he didn't really think he could ever get his male patients, out of castration anxiety, fear that they're going to lose the phallus, or his female patients out of penisnide, the idea or the fear or the anger that they had lost the penis and were now envious of it. So we see here an example of eroticism, if you like, condemned to hell, to think that we all have to walk around the rest of our lives with either envy for the penis or fear of losing the penis, is a loss of eroticism. It doesn't sound very erotic. It's more neurotic. What else does Lacan say on page 300? This is in, I think it's the final chapter, or one of the final two, the demand for happiness and the promise of analysis. There's something to remember whenever the analyst finds himself in the position of responding to anyone who asks them for happiness. The question of the sovereign good is one that mankind has asked themselves since time immemorial, but the analyst knows that it is a question that is closed. not only do they not only do they have that, hang on a second, not only don't they have that sovereign good that is asked of them, the analysts, but they also know there isn't any. To have carried an analysis through to its end is no more nor less than to have encountered that limit in which the problematic of desire is raised. So if we remember that that ladder of love, of hierarchical beauties that Plato sketched through the Symposium, through Socrates, who did it through Diotima, one of the figures in there. The idea that that sovereign good on the top, that we can use our desire for a beautiful body to sort of ascend up this ladder towards this pure spiritual good, and that's the ultimate happiness. What Lacan is saying is that that is a closed book. That is not really what your desire is for. It might be something, at some level, it might be what the ego wants or what the super ego is telling you to want, but desire is elsewhere. Desire is more connected to the polymorphous perversity and the idea of a fetish object like the good, like a moral good or some kind of a plug-in for the real. The idea that that's going to be pre-existing there to guide us and lure us as a really existing thing is not going to get us very far. In fact, it can more so be an alibi where the subject lies about itself and therefore reinforces the repression. Now, Freud comes at this advance of repression in a different way in the interpretation of dreams, 1900, with respect to Shakespeare's Hamlet. Right? He says Shakespeare's Hamlet has its roots in the same soil as Sophocles' Oedipus. But the changed treatment of the same material reveals the whole difference in the mental life of these two widely separated epochs as the advance of repression in the emotional life of mankind. So why is it an advance of repression? What are the same roots? Let's have a look. In Oedipus, the child's wishful fantasy that underlies it is brought into the open and realized as it would be in a dream. In that when you're watching Sophocles' Oedipus, you see Oedipus accidentally kill his father. He didn't know it was his father, and accidentally sleep with his mother. Didn't know it was his mother, but still we see the act of killing the father, sleeping with the mother, staged consciously on the stage. There's still a little symbol of negation in there. There's still a step, right? It's Oedipus didn't know. He didn't say, "Oh, there's my dad. I'll just kill him and take my mum." There's still a symbol of negation. He didn't know. Some mistake made by his birth parents. They heard the prophecy that I was going to do that, so of course they sent Oedipus out to be killed, and the person who was going to kill him couldn't kill a baby, so he just left it with a different polis, where Oedipus grew up not knowing who its real parents were, right? So it's there, but as negated, but still staged. What happens in Hamlet? Freud says, in Hamlet, it remains repressed, this structure, and just as in the case of a neurosis, we only learn of its existence from its inhibiting consequences. So why does Hamlet not take revenge for his father? Because the person he's supposed to take revenge on is basically doing what Hamlet himself would have liked to have done. He would have liked to have killed his father and taken his mother, and so he can't really do the act. You can see the Oedipus complex is in there, but it's inhibited, so he can't sort of execute. And Freud talks about how Hamlet's strange vacillation has been, or hesitancy has been there to confuse all. Right? We know about it from its inhibiting consequences. What's Lacan say? This is in the Seminar 6, Desire and its Interpretation, where Lacan then goes on to sort of focus on philia specifically too. He says, philia is quite obviously one of the most fascinating creations that has ever been offered to human imagination. It is remarkable to see what we might call the drama of the female object, the drama of desire, such as it appears at the beginning of civilization in the form of Helen of Troy, incarnated in the misfortune of Ophelia. This is taken up in many forms by artists who went so far as to provide us with polished paintings in which we find, in the very same terms as those provided by Shakespeare regarding Ophelia, floating in a dress down the river into which she, in her madness, allowed herself to slip. So he does a sort of cross-cut between the way Helen's beauty, Helen's erotic beauty, is seen as a kind of driving force and openly desired, and obviously so powerful, this desire, that it was the face that launched 1,000 ships, as the saying goes, to Ophelia, who was instead rejected, the beautiful Ophelia, who is rejected and eventually goes mad and slips into the river. Why? Freud tells us, and this is still Lacan on page 244, 45, Freud tells us that we see in the play a horror of femininity as such by Hamlet himself, as he throws in Ophelia's face all the degrading, fickle and corrupting possibilities linked to the unfolding of women's lives when they allow themselves to be dragged into all the acts that little by little make them into mothers, in the name of which Hamlet pushes Ophelia away in what seems to be a most sarcastic and cruel way. So there we have a male and female kind of example of how the advance of repression occurs between the Hellenic era and the Christian era, playing out in our artworks again. Here's another example that Bataille brings out after the war in his Cradle of Humanity book. He does a cross-cut between the Spuga Venus from 25,000 BC, statuette here, very, 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 very old. As he points out, the features emphasize fertility, hips or breasts, and it emphasizes them towards a deformed idealism in favor of animality. The human aspect is also suppressed. Absence of a face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and no ears. Reduction to the genetic functions. So it's almost like difficult to see that as a feminine form. You've got to imagine that the breasts are here in the front and the buttocks are there behind, which stands out a little bit more when you turn to the side. If you want a modern reference, think also about the fascination that the Kardashians caused in popular culture when they came out and became big in reality TV, when was it, 10 years ago or something, and getting implants to sort of make their butts look big. So, sometimes you see these sort of trends return somewhat. But that was the emphasis there that Bataille is talking about. It's all on the animal procreative genetic functions, right? Now compare that with, as he does, the Thomas Gainsborough's late 18th century portrait of Mrs. Graham, which places the most value on the face and thus erases all the accentuated secondary characteristics. The breasts are hardly developed, the hips are narrow, such that relative to the reproductive act, the seductive emphasis is now placed on the part of the figure furthest from the final goal. So this is also a kind of advance of repression, if you like, where in our artwork we are always creating more and more distance from the animal side of us, the sexual side of our stuff in our eroticism. There's still eroticism there, but it's less immediate, less direct. You can see this playing out in a number of ways. Now, let's have a look at Freud's Resistances to Psychoanalysis paper. Now, this one's important, and I've called it Misunderstanding the Treatment of Repression, because repression, when we hear the word and when we say, talk about repression as something bad, we might think we're advocating full hedonism, right? And it's always the accusation you get. It's like, oh, you're just arguing for like untamed instincts. Everyone's just being as perverse as they can. Hedonism gone mad, which incidentally is also what Cornelius Castoriadis accused Lacan of on the basis of his ethics seminar, which is a complete misreading of the ethics of psychoanalysis. For example, it leaves out that there's a whole major subdivision in there on the problem of sublimation. And that sublimation involving self-knowledge and some satisfaction of the drive is the ethics of psychoanalysis, not the repression or blind acting out. So even someone as clever as and as valuable to thought to intellectual life as Castoriadis can misinterpret Lacan in this way. And it was also happening to Freud. And it's the same when you talk about transgression in Bataille. People think you just mean more breaking rules. And it's like, no, there's something wrong with the rules. We've got to fix the rules because they line up under repression or excessive prohibition, which means we don't have knowledge. We lose knowledge of what our drives are. And then when we act them out in the form of some symptom, we don't really get full satisfaction either because it's some blind derivative, right? So let's have a look at what Freud says in 1925, the resistances to psychoanalysis, and remove any resistances we may see around us in the process. Says Freud, psychoanalysis has never said a word in favor of unfettering instincts that would injure our community. On the contrary, it warns us to mend our ways, right? But society refuses to consent to the question because it has a bad conscience. It has set up a high ideal of morality, morality being restriction of the instincts, and insists its members fulfill that ideal without considering how it bears heavily on the individual. In other words, this advance of repression has not really helped the individual. It's like a lodestone around their neck, right? Thus, society maintains a cultural hypocrisy and insecurity in guarding a precarious situation by forbidding criticism and discussion. As regards the sexual instincts, there is also that in most people that they are tamed insufficiently in a way which is psychologically wrong and are thus readier than the rest to break loose. So I've just put here a kind of a free associated series of examples. Like, think of the pedophilia scandals in the various Christian organizations, the Catholic ones in particular. No outlet. In the Catholic tradition, the priests aren't even allowed to marry. The ones that are homosexually inclined, that's also considered a sin. So what happens to their drive? Does it disappear? No, it's tamed insufficiently in a way that's psychologically wrong and ready than the rest to break loose, right? Let's look at all the horrors of colonialization and imperialism, the horrors of crusades and inquisitions, all the various bouts of anti-Semitism, sectarianism and capitalism. So these are the sort of isms, if you like, that really don't really subscribe much to psychoanalysis. Right, so don't blame us. We're not saying let's go be more perverse like those guys. We're saying it's the neurosis, it's the repression that's leading to this blind violence, which is always rationalized as the good. We're here to we're going to dispossess all these First Nations people for their own good. That's what the Christian mind tells itself, right? When meanwhile, it's just commercial motives disguised as Christian motives. Right, etc., etc., etc. You could go on forever with that, but that's not what the ethics of psychoanalysis is advocating. It wants us to stop this blind behavior. Right. Psychoanalysis proposes that there should be a reduction in strictness with which instincts are repressed, and correspondingly more play should be given to truthfulness. Repression should be replaced by a better and securer procedure. And this is page 220 of Standard Edition 19. Very, very good paper to read. And the important thing here is that it's 1925, so he already has his theory of the death instinct. It's not as if he's like, he was this sort of kind of a optimistic hedonist about the libido at the start, but then the death drive came along and became a pessimist. This is still 1925. He's saying that on balance, repression is a problem because it's too strict. Doesn't allow enough reality for the instincts, doesn't allow for the importance of sexuality. We can't do without it. It's like asking a person not to drink water. There's something to do with sexual satisfaction that is at the level of a need. The drive just like it keeps on going. And also more play should be given to truthfulness. So it's not all about just blindly acting on every impulse. It's about understanding it. It's about having knowledge of it. Right, it's not knowledge that you get going to a confessional and being told, that's Satan making you do those things and that's a sin. It's beyond that. Right, what's Lacan say? Back in the Ethics Seminar 7, in a chapter called the Jouissance, enjoyment of transgression. We have, of course, long learned to recognize in our analytical experience the jouissance of transgression, but we are far from knowing what its nature might be. In this respect, our position is ambiguous. Everybody knows that we have restored full civic rights to perversion. We have dubbed it a component drive, thereby implying the idea that it harmonizes with a totality, ... And that generally whenever Lacan uses the term harmony, he's making some kind of cynical point. I think if we could look at his CD collection, you'd probably find a lot of Schoenberg there or something, or jazz when they were hitting all blue notes, or because harmony seems to mean to him something fake, right? Of course, harmony can be made out of dissonance, as we know from, for example, Wagner's use of chromatics, or blues, the way it plays a pentatonic minor scale over a major chord to get its effect. All right, you can create harmony out of dissonance, but we've got to know what we're doing. And what he doesn't like is the idea that it's good. We restore rights to oral and anal drives, to scopophilic drives, to a little bit of like, consensual BDSM stuff, to homo and bisexuality and transsexuality. Okay, but don't think that therefore we can then get rid of it and become altruists either. Nah, those partial drives are like can't just be confessed and disposed of like an old tissue. Nah, they're still fundamental to the human psyche. So don't be too quick to try and turn this into a new sovereign good, which of course is what he thought object relations and ego psychology, the two dominant trends in psychoanalysis of his time. He thought that's what they were trying to do. Now, last week I thought that Freud's reference to the symposium, which we discussed, was from 3 essays, but turns out it is actually from the Resistances to Psychoanalysis as well. He says, moreover, because he's defending the charge that he's like just a sort of amoral hedonist, that's the ethics of psychoanalysis, as if the ethics of psychoanalysis has no ethics at all, just because it criticizes the Puritan moralizing of Christian Platonism, for example. He says, moreover, what psychoanalysis called sexuality was by no means identical with the genitals. It had far more resemblances to the all-inclusive and all-preserving eros of Plato's Symposium, where, remember the story? It's like you notice the beauty of an individual body, then you notice there's other beautiful bodies, so then you sort of think there must be an abstract idea of beauty. And then like as you climb up into the abstract for Plato, you've got the beauties of bodies of knowledge, science, beauties of art and poetry, and at the top the beauties of morality and philosophy, which inflates too far. And that's sort of like Plato's excess, right? He goes too far in the transcendental direction, which means the ideal of the good he creates is more repressive than something that can facilitate sublimation through an ethics of psychoanalysis. But nevertheless, the libido takes on all these like sublimated forms, but it can also take on neurotic substitutional forms. So, but nevertheless, Freud's point is it's not just the genitals looking to perform the procreative act, right? There's something more going on when it comes to the libido. Right, now, is it though, the collapse of this sort of inflated notion of the sovereign good that causes perversions? That's what I think the sort of the trajectory here is taking us towards. Does the good do more harm than good, if you like, in terms of perverse behavior? Now, let's leave genealogy aside for 1 second and have a look at the introduction to the reading you've got in your Lacan Circle Drive. This one was in your required reading box, I think. I put them in 3 boxes: required reading, recommended reading, and advanced reading. So we're going back from advanced readings now back into the original recommended or required readings. See if we can come at it in a different way. So if you remember in this introduction, we're starting off around page 5, you've got a kind of chapter summary of all the individual articles coming in the rest of the book. And the reason I gave you that introduction is because I couldn't give you the whole book, but at least by giving you the introduction, you get a sample, a summary of everything that goes on, all the papers in this book. So Joel Daw emphasizes a distinction between a perverse structure predicated on disavowal. So we've been thinking about that through Lacan's Seminar 4, and disavowal as the mechanism for this perverse structure, which we see, for example, most strikingly in fetishism, and which Bruce Fink wants to use as a separate clinical structure. Disavowal for perversion, repression for neurosis, and foreclosure for psychosis, right? The big 3, if you like. So there's disavowal, perverse structure, but then there are perverse traits found in obsessional neurosis and hysteria as well, right? But if it's neurosis, then it's not really disavowal, but rather just ordinary repression. So that's the sort of distinction that Joel Daw kind of like works with to try and solve this problem of what is perversion. Now, this is when we bring in Danny Novus, right? Because he argues against the idea of a separate perverse structure, and he thinks that it actually tends to be moralistic and stigmatizing. based on, say, any analyst in a given moment, counter-transference. They're sort of sum total of their biases and ignorances and hyper-presumptiveness when it comes to encountering another subject. Right? But then he also notes that the two central paradigms of perversion in Freud, that of the drive, intrinsically perverse, right, such as sadism, masochism, polymorphously perverse, a partial drive, right, which of course is what everyone has, so that can play out in like the neurotic structures as well, and psychosis. There's another author who talks about how it comes in psychosis as well, in a different kind of projection, where it's like it's the persecutory authority father that's doing all the perverse sort of behavior towards them, right? So that's one. There's perversion as linked to the intrinsic nature of the drive, and then there's that of fetishism relating to the discovery of sexual difference. The mother does not have a penis. What happens there? Disavowal through installation of a fetish object to maintain the belief that the mother has not been castrated. So these are the two: perverse structure based on disavowal, fetishism based on the discovery of sexual difference, and then the perverse, ordinary perversion or perverse trait linked to the drive itself. There's something non-moral about the drive, right? Especially the way we have historically defined the good, pretty narrow, right? The obvious example is the prohibiting of homoerotic acts. I think it took until the 70s for sodomy to be decriminalised. And if you have a look at some of the other laws around sex work, for example, they can still be pretty arbitrary and pretty moralistic and Christocentric, a lot of them, and inconsistent. Now, what's Astrid Gazert say? Whereas neurotic subjects suffer desire, embracing substitutes that inevitably fail, such as a bad metaphor, the perverse subject makes demands, believing that a particular object will do the trick, slick metonymies. So, on this account, you've got the neurotic subject, a bad metaphor, say, for example, Dora's cough, right? A bad metaphor for the desire to have oral pleasure, or thinking of some of the patients who couldn't walk or lost use of their hands or arms. It's like metaphors for the phallus, right? And then you've got the perverse subject instead, who thinks different objects will do the trick. If I just find someone with the right socks, or if I just find this right iPhone, right? It's like metonymies, something that stands in for the absent phallus that they once believed in. That's how Astrid Gazert wants to do wants to sort of make her way through this field. Now, Anne Worthington. So this is where we've got the sort of the bifurcation in the field, if you like. Unlike Danny Nobis, Worthington stresses the utility of Lacan's view of perversion as a structure, as a response to Oedipus and castration. She distinguishes two ways. One, being the phallus, offering the self as object cause of jouissance in the mother, like little Hans got lured into doing. And the other one, bearing the phallus, where you use a fetish as creating separation from the maternal other. And this is what little Hans, for example, as we discussed, wasn't able to do on Lacan's account. He was never able to integrate his phallic function. Instead, he became a kind of imaginary phallus, even a symbolic phallus for the mother, pushed into the priesthood, pushed into sainthood. So if you look at the standard mathemes here for neurosis, think of here the split subject looking for an object to fill in the gap. And then you here, on the other hand, I just reversed it. So instead of looking for an object, fetish object, the subject becomes the fetish object for the split subject. So seminar 4 is before object A. Object A, as Stephanie Swell points out, doesn't become theorized till seminar 6, 7, and 8. But there is a sort of connection between the imaginary phallus or the phallic object and the object A in terms of this being or bearing. Being the phallus for the split subject, so little Hans being the phallus for the mother's lack, right? Or if he instead did break away from the mother, took on identification with the father and then looked for a substitute mother or substitute woman, that was not his mother by the incest taboo. He would be the split subject. He's lost the mother, but he's a bearer of the phallus, and he's looking for somebody to, to be the object that will fill that lack, a new mother. It's typical examples. Now, what else does Worthington say? This also implies something is incomplete in relation to paternal function and the law. Where criminal transgression is often, so she's talking about the perverse structure, where criminal transgression, she doesn't say where criminal, but I'm putting that in there, so it's not sacred transgression or structured transgression, but criminal transgression is often a call for more authority. Why? To establish that separation, that distance, that regulation and limit to jouissance. Sometimes it can even look like an unconscious need for punishment. And I referenced here the Arthur Burns, the figure from the Nick Cave film, The Proposition, where he's a sort of psychopathic kind of resistor to colonial law, and not only does he kill, but he let's just say he really enjoys his work a little too much. Slowly gouging with the kind of weird cutlass and almost getting right close, which is what Gilda Reyes used to do too with his victims, which were way more gratuitous than this, symbolically well structured film by Nick Cave. But there's times where he says to his brother, "Why don't you ever just stop me?" Because he knows his brother hates it. They're in a crime gang together, but his brother hates it when he goes too far like that. And at the end, when his younger brother does shoot him, he says, "You finally stopped me." So, and then he's looking for a limit. He can't stop himself. There's method to his madness, like in that Anglo-Irish tension at the beginning of the colony. But there's also, it's getting away from him. He's looking for that limit. So that's a sort of example of what these Fink, Swales and Worthington line are going for. So Worthington refers to Bruce Fink and Stephanie Swales case studies where the treatment calls for a prop-up of the symbolic father to create separation through a sublimation of their favoured fetish object, which is already a partial attempt at this. So that's my paraphrase, right? So if you remember the example of the boot book, it's about taking that fetish object and seeing it as a failed attempt to kind of create the right amount of distance from the initial connection with the mother, right? By looking at the signifiers at play. And Swales also talks about a flasher Chris, right? Like a flasher that she had, because she actually works with sex criminals and sex offenders. But of course, we also have the problem when we looking for a symbolic father to create that separation. What if that symbolic father was the cause of perversion to begin with? So we've got to be careful about how we invoke the paternal function, how we invoke this paternal good that's supposed to create this separation. For example, if we're going to use the Christian one, like they might do in the what's it called, the 12-step program with Alcoholics Anonymous. I think it actually was invented by Jung, but it seems like, from what little I know of it, that it's all about finding God's love in order to create separation from the oral fixation on the breast/drink. That's maybe a little bit undesirable. It's going to create as many perversions as it solves. So let's have a look at Swales' Flasher Chris case. And this is discussed by Anne Worthington. Reported that Chris had committed thousands of acts of indecent exposure. Convicted of less than 10, right? So he got away with a lot of them. And this is because the limit came when Chris imagined the presence of a police officer. If the woman screamed or reached for a phone, Chris would leave the scene, right? So he's finding that limit by this sort of look of fright. I'll call the police. There's the limit, paternal function. Now I've got separation, run off, right? Now, let's look at his case history. The actual father is described as a monstrous figure who threw temper tantrums and who thus left all child-rearing duties to his wife. Now, the account is that by being this sort of aggressive brute, he did create the initial sort of incest taboo, but because of his inconsistency, there was also, it wasn't a really stable distantiating force, right? All the child-rearing duties left to his wife. Of course, I've written here consequence or cause. We have to look at specificities where, if the mother sidelines the father and that's why he's ranting and raving, then, and that's what creates not enough separation, then we have to look at the sort of relationship between the couples too. Often it takes two to tango. Apparently 50% or 45% of marriages end in divorce these days. So yeah, it's yeah, tension between parents is pretty common. Now, so the father's childishness and inconsistencies resulted in something incomplete in the role of the law-giving other, right? So Chris had other strategies to invoke the law-giving other, besides his flashing and running when the threat of somebody like catching him. He has a decision to enlist in the military, an organisation representative of the law, as a further attempt to support the paternal function. So if you're looking to prop up the paternal function, go somewhere where law is really strong and obviously paternal or masculine in its kind of in its countenance. For example, military, physical strength, guns, death, violence, direct, right? There's also his habitual writing of letters of complaint, right? No matter what the issue, like someone did something wrong in a restaurant, and you get really let's see, dear counsellor, or whoever it was, right? Write these letters of complaint, also interpreted as a creative and law-abiding way to prop up the paternal function. Appeal to an authority figure to recognise that a moral law had been broken, who would enforce the rules more strictly. So that can be, it can be okay if it's done in the right way, but it could also risk an authoritarian kind of structure where the subject wants more and more like strength and authority from this authority figure until they actually start supporting authoritarian structures of oppression, for example. We might call the conservatives in politics, or the far right. Right. Now, what Stephanie Swale say herself from her Perversion book, Lacanian psychoanalytic approach to the subject. The mechanism, I think this one is one I got from Eugenie in the Lacan Circle Facebook site earlier on in the year. I thought this is interesting, the way it's all rolled together. The mechanism of disavowal should be understood as a defense, not against the law-giving other's demand, like the father, that the child sacrifice response, let go of your mother, right? Which is what the neurotic might be suffering from. But on the contrary, against the inadequacy of the law-giving other. There's no father to help them make that separation. They're trying to create one in some way. That's what their behavior is doing, right? So disavowal is a creative attempt to prop up the law because the mechanism is disavowal. She hasn't been castrated. I can be the phallus for the mother in some way. I can bear the phallus for the mother in some way. I'm still connected to the mother's desire, right? Disavowal is a creative attempt to prop up the law and set limits to the excess in jouissance experienced due to the child's problematic relationship to the first big other, which of course is the mother. Often that they'll put a little m, lowercase m next to that as well to stress that. I know very well, says this perverse structure, that my father or father figure hasn't forced me to give up my mother and my corresponding jouissance, but I'm going to make believe that the force of law exists with someone or something that represents my father. It's interesting that it doesn't really seem necessarily to do with the discovery of sexual difference. It just seems to do with how much separation there is via the paternal function at all. Yeah, which is interesting. Now, oops, it's what happened there? Okay, this has just gone ballistic on me for a second. Hang on a sec. Okay, that's just ruined my surprise of slides to come, but never mind. Okay, so where were we up to? Oh, it looks like we've got a tech. Oh, there it is. It was just delayed. I think this is Lacanian's Akri, right? Cited in Fink's chapter on perversion, which you've got in your second box, the recommended readings. The neurotic says the other must not get off on me, right? Because they've got the other already on their back, denying them the ability to get their jouissance, as if everything's like, violating the incest taboo and a violation of their mother, right? The other must not get off on me, whether in the form of the law or anything. While certain perverts seem to say instead, let the other get off on me. Let me become the instrument of the other's jouissance. So I think he's talking about there for the masochist subject. If you remember the Kink documentary produced by James Franco, it's a really existing pornography studio, BDSM in San Francisco, one of the leading ones. how much anxiety the one who was in the sadistic position was doing. All like, are you sure that's all right? Are you sure that's not too tight? And the sort of one of the masochist position was like, oh no, no, keep going, keep going, keep going. It's the anxiety of the sadist that helps the masochist limit their jouissance. So that's a sort of an example of what she's talking about there, or what Lacan's talking about there. But then we see other ways like let's call the cops on me. I want somebody to tell me off so I can know how to limit my jouissance. So that's a sort of the move that they're going for there in the Swales Fink line. Now, let's have a look now at some artistic uses of jouissance. All right, so this is from Diana Kamieni-Boskowski, who's one of the editors of the Perversion Now book. There's a very interesting article called Neither Loss Nor Mourning But Perversion. So she's going to talk about, it's actually a subsection. Yeah, no, there it is there. There's a little picture of it up there in between the legs. She's going to talk about perversion as, sometimes connected to castration, like the literal discovery of sexual difference, sometimes just connected to loss in general. Like, is that the only thing we lose in life? We lose things all the time. It's not like just this belief in an alleged female phallus that we lose, right? We're always losing stuff. We're always losing jobs, losing relationships, getting rejected from this application, rejected from that advance. Loss, our football team loses. Lots of things happen that's a loss, right? So she says, in contrast with perversion that is well-defined, repetitive, and clearly connected to the denial of castration, a clearly established fantasy, so these are the perverse fetishistic structures, right? There is also a perverse use of jouissance, which is much less well-defined, not necessarily connected to the discovery of sexual difference. This perverse use can be limited to a specific object or person, or to a form of relationship to the big other, some authority figure or structure. In our two cases, loss appears to be the negative counterpart of a certain use of jouissance, where not only is the loss not symbolized, but it remains absent from the subject's imaginary. What results is artistic production that can take the form of a perverse practice. So it's about these losses not being adequately symbolized, or being symbolized in a peculiar way. It seems to remain absent from their practice. So let's have a look at her example. Pierre Molyneux, and this is what all these legs are about, right? It is well known that Pierre Molyneux had a sister whose legs he greatly admired, and who died when he was 15 years old. So there's the loss, right? Death of a sister. What is somewhat less known is that after his sister's death, he experienced an orgasm while caressing her legs during the wake. A singular kind of orgasm is that one. He became the inventor of surrealist photography. In his works, legs proliferate. All right. So we had the loss of the sister who had legs he liked, but also in that he, was it accidentally brushed him, or we just did it without thinking and he had an orgasm? We also have a loss of the incest taboo, right? So it's a couple of losses maybe playing out there, but also the leg is a very phallic object. So maybe it is connected to the initial loss of the believed in female phallus, female penis. And what's he do in his work? He stages these legs, identifying with the body of his dead sister. So sometimes he identifies with the body in that he dresses up in the clothes himself, right? Bears witness to a denial of loss. She's not gone, she's right here. Right? I embody it, right? I remake it appear in front of me. Fixated in the place of denial, as the last image preserved after the traumatic recognition, the fetishization of the legs, foreclosure of mourning or loss. Then she slips into the language of psychosis there, which is, maybe she's just using it as a general term, but there are some people who wonder whether perversion as a structure is similar to foreclosure, whether the disavowal is actually a foreclosure of castration or of sexual difference. Right. Molyneux's relationship to the death of his father was also quite particular. He kept the father's bones in a suitcase in his workshop. The scene he used to repeat in this workshop was organised around a mirror, a bed, the body in very precise positions, the legs, and often a photo taken in this moment. He dressed like a seductive woman for these artistic photographs, and he committed suicide in the same place. Very striking collection of sentences, very nicely scansioned as well. I was very struck when I first read that one, but the fact that the father's there and having some role, and that also a committing of suicide, make it a very striking case study. This is some of the artwork. I believe he was using the sort of slow shutter speed, so he could like set up multiple, take a photo, slow shutter speed, and he runs around and puts the other leg there, so that it looks like they're all in there at once. I imagine that would be the way he was doing it at the beginning of surrealist photography. Now, what's Lacan saying 7R4 to shed light on this very interesting kind of perverse use of jouissance? The subject aligns himself not as though he were in front of the veil, but as though he were behind it, that is, in the mother's place, adhering to the position of identification with the mother, as if she needs to be protected. So this is one example. In one case he was looking at where there was that sadistic misinterpretation of the act of coitus. Unlike Wolfman, who thought the mother looked like she was in the best position of all and indicated it by passing a stool, making his anus the sort of passive receptor of the phallus. This subject thought his mother's being hurt, and his identification with her was his way of protecting the mother in some way, identifying with the mother as if she needed to be protected. This is what affords, says Lacan, the transition between cases of fetishism and those of transvestism, which is interesting because why can't transvestism be the self-fetishization that Estella Belden talks about, which is very common, for example, in female subjects with their adornment and their attention to the beauty, the fashion, the makeup, the hair, the clothing, and all the rest. Right. The envelopment, when they put on the clothing, the envelopment is not a veil, but a protection, an aegis in which the subject, identified with the female personage, envelops himself. So we see an example of the aegis there on the far right in a statue of Athena, ancient statue. Right. In transvestism, the subject identifies with what lies behind the veil, with the object that lacks something, with the phallic mother in so much as she veils over the lack of the phallus, hiding the object, but also hiding the lack of the object. So if you look at why does he use the term aegis, the aegis was a device carried by Athena, sometimes Zeus, an animal skin or a shield featuring a head of a gorgon, to act as protection. And among them, this is from Homer's Iliad, and among them went bright-eyed Athena, holding the precious aegis, which is ageless and immortal. 100 tassels of pure gold hang fluttering from it. So that could be the displacement of the sort of phallus that's at issue there, right? And the discovery of difference. Tight woven each of them, and each worth of 100 oxen. So it's a magical protective veil they're putting on to protect the mother through this identification, to protect the loss that they believe that the mother's experiencing. So now, let's have a look at Michael Newman in the introduction to Perversion now. Michael Newman turns to a precursor of Molyneux, the artist Hans Belmer, who all readers of Bataille would be familiar with for his illustrating of some of Bataille's erotic novels, right? Madame with Water, the most famous one, perhaps. Right, so Newman argues, and this is from the introduction, giving an account of it, that Belmer's work constitutes a subjective symbolic as opposed to the symbolic, right? And thus that his perverse artistic practices are not so much sublimation as they are a santome. So a santome, it's not sublimating in towards the pre-existing symbolic, but creating a different version of it, a subjective version. Both Belmer and Molyneux follow contradictory impulses of eruption and reassembly in their photo montages and photographs, creating frozen moments, returning again and again to the same scene of fixation that came in place, as Camini says, of denial of the mother's castration. Although in Molyneux's case, it seemed to be denial of the loss of the sister, although it was exactly her legs, and a violation of the incest taboo. So it could have something pre-existing there, but maybe not. But there's a returning to that frozen moment again and again, which characterizes the fetishistic structure. Now, Here's an example from Newman's actual article from page 158 of the collection, if anyone's managed to get their hands on it. Belmer had emerged from his carriage wearing thick makeup and heavy lipstick, with kiss curls drawn in charcoal on his powdered cheeks. The image of open provocation was completed with a black bowler hat on his head. His father had no choice but to accompany this extraordinary sight across Berlin to the hotel. A provocation indeed, says Newman, but also a scene of seduction, with Belmer turning himself into a doll. So he famously makes these dolls, as you see on the left here. Belmer turning himself into a doll, but also instability, says Newman, in the signifiers of sexual difference, both powdered cheeks and bowler hat. So he's mixing in the masculine and the feminine there, mixing in the two identifications perhaps. Not necessarily, but maybe in Belmar's case. Raises the question, when it comes to Belmar's making of the dolls, of the position of identification and relation to the father. So in one sense, he is his father. In the other sense, he's his mother for his father, right? So he's switching between those two positions. If the dolls are Belmar's object, does he not also identify with them in relation to the father, right? Either by becoming the doll himself, as in this scene in Berlin, or through the dolls he makes, right? Seems to be an ambivalence. Belmer mocks his father while his mother enters into collusion with him, because his mother sends him the dolls for him to refashion. He refashions the dolls like his father, because his father was a practical man, an engineer. So he's remaking these dolls using the sort of paternal identification too. He's engineering them. And some of them are quite fantabulous in their sort of construction, as you see here from a few examples. Right, it's 8 o'clock. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and resume a little bit longer with Newman's Hans Belmer case. And then we'll sort of sum up, enter into discussion, and launch into our week off, recovering everything we've done so far. Okay, see you soon. Okay, couple more slides on the wonderful work of Hans Bellmer as told by Michael Newman in the Perversion Now book. Michael Newman, I believe, was in was or is or was an academic from Goldsmiths in the UK, where Michael Richardson is at some capacity. Michael Richardson did a lot of the early translation work of Lacan's work, in particular, Bataille's work, sorry, nice slip, Bataille's work, in particular his work on with the surrealists, countering the notion that that Bataille was anti-surrealist and more of a postmodern sort of relativist, showing that Bataille, even though there was a dispute with Breton, there was a connection that remained with surrealism and, caused by implication, with psychoanalysis, since surrealism's notion of automatic writing was basically the Freudian technique of free association, to suspend the watch of the gates of reason and let the imagination just flow through and try not to filter and see what emerges as a result of that. Now, Newman, what's he say? He's talking about how Bellmer's wonderful dolls here on the left and the right. The doll has a double character. At once a virgin girl with the short white socks, idealized, but also a knowing woman. In other words, before and after some kind of violation. She is at the two poles of one, base, abject waste, and two, remote and pure. Lacan in Seminar 7 writes of sublimation as raising an object to the dignity of the thing. The doll is at the two limits of the object, below as cast off and above as pure. So when we raise an object to the dignity of the thing, it's not as if the thing is completely hidden. If the thing is completely hidden or lost, then it's not a sublimation, it's a neurotic substitution, right? And what the theory of sublimation in Lacan Seminar 7 is, it raises an object to the dignity of the thing, but the thing is still present in then, is what gives it its jouissance, both for the author, for the artist, and for the viewer, right? The doll is at the two limits of the object. Below is cast off and above is pure. Below is connected to the thing, below from beneath the belt, and above is pure from the mind, the soul, the psyche. But how big does that distinction get? Does it turn into a split, right? That's the issue. At either extreme, continues Newman, she would be out of circulation, outside the chain of signifiers, a substitution of objects governed by the symbolic. Because something that's too low is unassimilable. Something that's too high just flies away from Earth and becomes detached, outside of the normal symbolic or the usual symbolic. Newman continues, as Lacan says vis-a-vis Joyce, the artist's knowledge is a savoir-faire, a socialized speech. Even in Seminar 7, in the account of sublimation Lacan gives, Lacan's very keen to sort of reject the Lacanian notion of sublimation, that all the artist does is repair some lesion felt with the mother's body. He's saying that, but Freud also insists that it has to involve the paternal function in some way. It has to involve some kind of social recognition. So it's a savoir-faire, it's a socialized speech. If the artist doesn't get recognized by the public, then he doesn't really ever get his jouissance back to the extent that he might, or it's not really a sublimation, right? There is an obvious anamorphic dimension to this, to induce a division and a gaze in the field of the visible. All right, so it's talking about the dolls here, and the gaze as object, as the real that we see in Seminar 11, right? When something that we see is not something we objectify, but it's something that dissolves our objectifying capacities. But the axis also creates a limit or vortex where the body is sucked up into nothingness. This produces a sense of horror, which Bellmer describes according to the metaphor of a candle melting in its own wax, the catastrophic collapse of the phallus into an inform, formless blob. And inform is one of the famous papers from Bataille's Documents journal, which is one that's very popular in art history. The idea of wherever we establish form, the beauty of forms, it's sort of connected to his critique of the Icarus complex. He's there to show the shit on the trouser stain of the one who's like creating the lofty ideal, or even something like in the language of flowers, he talks about the beauty of the petals Don't forget that those roots are wallowing in the mud, drawing sustenance from decay and decomposition, right? For every beautiful form, there is a formless that sustains it. Or the big toe, there's a whole entry on the big toe, which is a nice close-up of the toe too, which is that no matter how upright and vertical we get, we will be falling over like idiots if we didn't have that big toe to stabilize us, right? That big toe in the mud. And he sort of makes a couple of comments about foot fetishism in that context too. All right, so Newman continues, the joint of the symmetrical division. So look at this sort of internal sort of part of the body here of the doll on the right. A figure of the female sex, question, is unified by a whip which produces the maternal or imaginary phallus. Now, unfortunately, I could not find the exact doll with the whip he was talking about. So this one on the top right here was the closest I could do. Maybe that's the whip, maybe it's not. I don't know. Someone could inform me during the discussion. Now, this is back to Diana Camieni, one of the editors, but in her own article when she talks about Molyneux, right? She notes the artistic production where jouissance seems to derive from losses that have not been symbolized. Lacan detects a connection between a loss and the fetish, for example, in the Gide article in Écrit. The burning of Gide's correspondences by his wife, in which he placed his soul, as Lacan put it, their fetishistic nature, the phallic value, the further loss of Gide's father, leaving Gide to the mercy of his mother. Then she goes on to talk about a filmmaker, a Japanese filmmaker, on Melancholia by Ryu Murakami. A woman he lost, the figure in the book that was made into a film. There's a woman that he lost, right? One of the losses. Prior to that, there was a loss of a dog. Prior to that, there was the loss of his father in his childhood. Then there was a loss of a child at birth with his own partner. Then there was a series of losses, like a series of relationships that kind of dissolved. Loss, right? He cannot help but repeat the abandonment on an object of jouissance, however, rather than a love object. So that's what this figure on the top right is. I chose an abandoned greenhouse and I set it on fire. So the abandoned, in their way of dealing with their loss, becomes the abandoner as a way of kind of mastering the experience in a kind of perverse practice. Regarding Belmer and Joyce, Diana Camieni, a real substitute for the accounting function of phallus. So this is when the perverse practice starts resembling something like a symptom more than a sublimation, because of the way it almost recreates the symbolic. A substitute for the normal or the usual accounting function of the phallus. It's interesting, that phrase, accounting function, because I guess it's like, you remember when little Hans, right, when he's discovering, okay, Whittler, no Whittler, Whittler, no Whittler. It's like the accounting that sort of initiates the sort of typical notion of the symbolic based on the logic of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle. Not to mention everything else is going there, because, you know, as we know, the female never had a penis. She has something different. So it's not just the absence of a phallus there, has not. It's something completely different. It's a presence in its own right. But the child, it doesn't work that out till he gets older. Not allowing the loss to be symbolized, because it can be a frightful discovery for a child, right? Takes its place, can take place. A real substitute for the phallus, not allowing the loss of it to be symbolized due to the fright, castration fright, the Medusa's head, can take place. The santome. In the case of Joyce, the use of the letters to Nora, such jouissance. I remember reading about Joyce that he wanted to recreate the conscience of his entire race, his Irish race, by removing English from it, mixing in Gaelic and Greek, I think. There's a picture of a Gide down here on the bottom left, and there's another sort of still from a Murakami film. I like it, the sort of perfunctory way, the madame, the brothel answers the phone. Are you an S or an M, sir? Both? An S and an M? Okay, that's fine. Yeah, we're saying it all. Okay, put you in at 6, see ya. An S and an M, so one can sort of switch between these positions too, just as we can switch between the identifications with the masculine and the feminine, which is what Balmer was doing in his recreation of the symbolic, a mixture of masculine and feminine, the mother and the father in the work. Now, this was a summary I attempted of the entire field back in April. based on all the literature and all the reading that I'd been redoing. I was going to open up with it earlier, and I thought, I need to discuss this first, need to discuss that first, need to discuss that first. And so it's got to the point where I said, okay, it's been 5 weeks. We're about to stop for the break. So now I can bring it out. Let's see if we can sort of understand what's going on here. So what is the perverse? I broke it down into three basic categories. Perverse behavior connected to, say, moralism, acting out. When we're so ignorant about our drive, so repressed that we sort of act it out, we project through aggressive behavior. Right? That's morality itself can be perverse. It's one of the sort of paradoxes we've been exploring. Classic examples, burning witches at the stake, burning scientists at the stake, burning heretics, crusades and inquisitions, right? Really obvious examples from the medieval era, but also more controversial examples like colonization and our attempts to ethically decolonize, and how that's going and not going so well, since it's led to trust being set up and a lot of looting by the former colonialists. Then there's also perverse behavior in terms of actual enjoyment of transgression, where this can be done in a knowing, open and guided way, say in an artistic practice, in a sort of a consensual sexual situation, the moment of a festival and an artistic work. All right, there's perverse behavior happening, but it's not necessarily due to moralistic blind acting out. There could be more consciousness. Then you've got the perversion, if you look down the bottom here, connected to the partial drives themselves, because you remember that was one of the definitions that Freud toyed with, and that Lacan wanted to not reduce the field to, right? So I've just put it as one of the positions here. A fixation or a regression to a previous fixation on a pregenital drive. So as we went through the oral and anal development into the phallic phase, Oedipus castration complex, and then the genital phase, latency comes back in puberty proper. Something got stuck at the, say, anal phase, right? And this is when we looked at the beating fantasies. The child is being beaten. We had people in the masochistic position. Rousseau was a famous one, right? He confessed to getting aroused, getting hard while he was beaten by a mother substitute. I put Keira Knightley there because I don't know if you remember that Cronenberg film, Keira Knightley's character, the Russian analyst Sabina Spielrein. Her treatment with Jung, played by Michael Fassbender, involved being spanked to an orgasm at the end of every session. Right? It's not appropriate according to Freudian practice, but that can be one where the father is doing the beating. And you've got the sadistic aspect too, where it's sibling rivalry. It's like my father's beating a sibling, to prove that I'm the favored one. But then it could also be turned on the self. My father is beating me, part of the sadistic misinterpretation of sex, where it's a metaphor for the actual act of penetration. So that way the incest taboo is preserved. In more ways than one, I'm being punished by him, not fucked by him. So I'm not like violating the incest taboo. I'm not an Oedipus or a femdipus, right? And then we got Pomier's like notion of male, which is sort of like a Mobian type thing, where the male objectifies the female in order to take her as an object, as a way of kind of taking a sadistic position to separate from the mother by reducing her to an object. But that's also there in some of the criminal cases Freud discusses at the end of the fetishism paper, where is that figure of the coup de nature or whatever, that serial killer who likes to cut women's hair, or other people who might enjoy sadistic behavior towards women. He says it's almost like they're thanking them for castration, or identifying with the castrating father and acting it out in this perverse sadistic way, being the beater, right? Forcing the castration in the blind acting out sort of way. Freud also used the example of the mutilating of the foot fetish, that sort of old practice in some like parts of history, where the woman's foot was like mutilated and then revered as a fetish, as Freud says, if they were thanking them for their being castrated. Okay, now let's look at the middle structure, or the middle section here, because I think that's the one where Lacan focuses most on in Seminar 4. Well, that's one way to look at it anyway. Disavowal and fetishism, right? disavow linked to the discovery of sexual difference. So instead of like full symbolization of this loss of the fetish, of the phallus, we have only part symbolization. That's where it's disavowed. It's both acknowledged but denied at the same time. And it's a little bit more like a kind of foregrounding and backgrounding. If I keep it out of my mind, I can enjoy that leg as if it's a phallus. Really, I know it's not a phallus. That's why, like, I enjoy the fact that it's a woman, for example, right? So it could be, but it can also be general losses connected to loss of relationships, dogs, parents, children, anything. Okay, now what are the different ways that one deals with this? Identification. So we had Molyneux identifying with his lost sister. We had Hans identifying with the mother's lost phallus. We had the transvestite subjects too, who were identifying with the mother as phallic, right, which is something a little bit different. And then they can also identify with the father as the castrating agent by bearing the phallus and becoming like him for a substitute, but not necessarily in a criminal way. Repetition from passive to active. So that can be the idea of we're subject to an experience and we master it by acting it out, but depending on how well that's symbolized or not, it can be perverse in the criminal sense, but not necessarily. Then you've got the idea of substituting the whole symbolic. That's when you had the cases of the Santome and Joyce and Balmer, when it seems to get close to psychosis, but whether it is or not, it depends on how well they do in recreating the symbolic. Who knows, maybe it can, reform the symbolic in some way, as we see, for example, in some of the queer and trans phenomena that we encounter today. And then there's the process of inversion, where there's the case of the homosexual woman, where Lacan interprets her as perverse, which, at the start it's odd because, isn't homosexuality supposed to be inverse, not perverse in psychoanalysis? But if it involves an identification with the father and the father's perverse, then of course they can take on the perversion of the father, even if they're in an inverse position, like the case of the homosexual woman. But what she's doing there is something slightly different, Lacan says, where why he calls it perverse is because she believes that the child that her friend had, that mother is friend of the family, is her phallus, and she's using that to pursue the lady she's pursuing, but in a platonic way, because she's doing it in a way that sort of suggests that there is a lack there. I don't really have it, and in order to chastise her father for having sex with her mother and having another kid with her instead of her. So that's sort of like the treatment you get there in the inversion in the case of the homosexual woman. Very complicated one, an interesting one to look at, along with all the others. There's a lot. I hope that was a good initial way of oops, that's for damn it, why is it spoiling surprise? That's for after the break. I'll stop the screen share now, and we'll have half an hour or so of discussion to finish off.
Thanks, Tim. That was really good. I'm just wondering if you could sort of repeat yourself, as it were, but just give a little snapshot of the syntome versus sublimation. How do you position them?
I think the difference is that to do with the accounting function of the phallus, to do with the sort of the binary of male and female, or that difference being like set and the basis of the symbolic. That in the case of Balmer, it was about mixing the masculine and the feminine. So in a way that was due to its instability outside of the normal symbolic function. So it wasn't a sublimation because it couldn't achieve social recognition in the same in the typical symbolic way, but it was reinventing it somehow through his invention of the dolls and the mixing of the properties, the masculine and feminine there. That's what I think Newman was getting there. Well, with Joyce, it was like to radically recreate the whole language, to recreate the language, the conscience of his race by his intervention into language and all these riddles and puns that, you just open up a page and, you don't know what's going on. So it's a santome because it seems like a subjective symbolic rather than the symbolic, I guess is the difference. Where the symbolic is just usually something that's more commonly agreed upon by the socius.
Thank you. That helps.
William McNeil raised hand.
Thanks, Tim. Much appreciated. Look, I'm curious about the structure of disavowal, and particularly this doubleness of acknowledgement and denial. And I'm just wondering what the acknowledgement and the denial goes to. I mean, it clearly can't be castration, because I think castration is refused. So the Oedipus complex fails with the perverse. So I'm wondering, is the acknowledgement and the denial then about the mother's phallus, which in a sense is acknowledged, but then denied, and then covered up by the variety of, this substitute symbolics or the inversions or the repetitions or the identifications. So I guess, what is it that the pervert knows and does not know?
I think the pervert knows, but they seem to strategically background that knowledge in order to enjoy their fetish object as if they didn't know.
Right.
As if, look at that beautiful long boot on that nice long leg. There is a phallus there. The mother or the woman does have a phallus, but I know that it's not a phallus. I'm not like, really, my main goal is the vagina. But it's used as a sort of element to kind of arouse them and fend off the sort of castration anxiety.
I guess I wasn't talking about the object itself. I was talking about, the sort of the object cause, and the way that pervert and the pervert structure positions themselves with respect to the mother other. And is the acknowledgement and denial really about, the presence or absence of the maternal phallus?
I think it could be one of the things, but it could be other losses that could be involved as well.
Sure.
And that's when we might switch from a fetishist, pure and simple fetishist, to an ordinary fetishist who has various fetishes, but not like just that one thing that's substituted for the genital act itself, or other losses. The loss of the sister, loss of a child, loss of a dog, loss of a parent, loss of a job, loss of a relationship. Like they could be only partly symbolized in order for jouissance to still take place and for the subject to try and create a distance from it. It's like I can't move on. I'm so distraught by this loss, but I need to try. I know if I don't, I'm just going to die. So I need to try. I need to look for something to count as a kind of lure or fetish to help act as a kind of protectorate for me to sort of get through this loss. If it's a transitional fetish, if it's not, then the subject can become stuck there for good, or until they see an analysis or have some unfortunate end.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Is that all right, Chair? Eugenie, is that fine? Or is there a queue?
We've got one other hand up and we've got plenty of time, so.
Okay, great. Look, thanks for the mapping too. That was brilliant. And I think you were probably right to delay it. I don't think it would have made sense, unless you have the 5 lectures. So this is a nice distillation. And I noted that you identified the area of the partial drives with Freud, largely, and that's a child is being beaten and, masochism and sadism, and then structure with Lacan, and of course the disavowal and the doubleness and all the stuff about fetishism and, I know this doesn't exist, but nonetheless I will act as if, that sort of thing. I'm just wondering about behavior. And is that the sort of the Nietzschean genealogy, this kind of historicist, about the twilight of the gods and the emergence of repression, Moses and monotheism, and is that?
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as historicist. That's usually a position attributed to postmodern relativism, and like that's a very unfortunately common misreading of Nietzsche, which radically leaves out Nietzsche's empiricist side. But it's definitely not ahistorical. So that's what his genealogy is about.
Oh, it's like there's a narrative there, That's
Sorry.
like what I meant was, so I wasn't using it.
All right, but anyway, it's also there in Lacan, like when he says in Seminar 7 that when he's talking about how we now have the technology to destroy one another down to the last man, and it's not perverts but bureaucrats are going to set this thing off. So it's like all these sort of neurotics who are rationalizing that they're acting according to the sovereign good. They're the ones with their fingers on the button saying invade, bomb, destroy, getting caught up, it's their fault, we've got to get them, those evil Russians or those evil terrorists or those evil communists or, evil heretic, you go back even further. So it's there in Lacan as well, and it's there in Freud as well, civilization is discontent. But yeah, I think Bataille and Nietzsche's genealogies or their histories can really support and augment that sort of coming to terms with that process as well.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sandra and then Milanda, unless there's something in the chat as well at some point. Okay, Sandra.
Thank you so much. It's been all very amazing. I wanted to comment. I've got plenty. I have this issue. I've also mentioned it in my past comments with the envy of penis. Of course, I understand this is a penis night, right? And it's a fear, and we have to understand that it's a symbolization of precisely phallus, right? And it does not literally refer to the actual penis, right? And but still we're saying that did I understand that correctly, that that this penis night comes from the feet, from the girl, from the woman, and that this and does this constitute being a feminine position? I don't know. But this is one thing, and just another thing. This desire to prop up the paternal metaphor, the law, the order, in acting out or in whichever way we. This reminded me of this. I don't know, because we're thinking, oh, maybe we shouldn't have prohibition. This is a common critique, but we know we do need limits. We need and precisely these limits are what maybe heighten the erotic experience. I remember this was a comment on your presentation. So in the end, the result, whenever we have prohibition, because if there were no limits, if there was just a free polymorphous just free, you could do whatever you want, would it be erotic? Would there be pleasure in it? I'm not sure. This is what I was wondering. And just one last thing, you're now the difference between symptom and symptom. Just I noticed this. Why? When do we switch to the other? Or because I know symptom is. I think it's a wordplay with a saint and homme, but I don't know if this is the case. And homme in French. And I just, if you could tell a little bit more about the difference between symptom and symptom.
Okay. 3 questions there, so I'll do my best. So just remind me if I've forgotten one of the details on the way through. Now, you start off with penisnide. Penisnide in the girl, is this the typical feminine position, or is this the feminine position? I would say it's a typical neurosis in the feminine position. So not everybody is equally condemned to neurosis, but that can be the way that neurosis in a feminine subject or little girl will play itself out, stemming from the mother who tries to have a child as a kind of replacement for the lost phallus. If there is envy involved in that, there might be ambivalence towards the child as the phallic object. There might be all sorts of things going on there, including not allowing the child enough space to form its own symbolic identity. You're my phallus, I made you, you're mine. And there's also the suggestion from Lacan that male subjects with perverse structures tended to have mothers with penisnide or with strong penisnide. And I was trying to think, like, why would that be the case? So if you walk around and talk to fetishists at a club, or read about them in the literature, thing, did they all have mothers with penis envy? Why? How could that be? I think it's because it's the envy is an unconscious sort of overprivileging of a phallus. So if you thought, okay, men have got their thing, we've got our thing, these are equally affirmable in different ways, there's no jealousy, so there's no phallocentrism. But of course, and this is where the historical argument comes into place too, like, to not have phallocentrism, we have to not have Christianity and not have Platonism anymore. So that's continuing the work of transforming the symbolic, where at times it will seem like we're coming up with something completely idiosyncratic and subjective as opposed to the symbolic, because we're challenging some Christocentric aspect of it. So there's always that sort of, the shifting sands of social approval, which sometimes can be the difference between santome and sublimation. Sometimes we don't achieve, as Nietzsche puts it, sometimes we don't achieve applause in the theatres because the seats were filled with idiots. And sometimes when we do achieve applause, like Wagner's final play, The Pastoral, it's because the seats are filled with idiots. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything to get social recognition or not, unless we apply sort of higher ethical standards to what's being portrayed there. And the three part, there was a middle part. There was penis envy at the start, santome at the end. What was in the middle? Oh yeah, limits. Yes, of course. So Bataille responds to this charge that he's an ardent advocate limit of excess and transgression by saying, and Michael Richardson points this out as well, that all through you find Bataille saying that the only thing more boring than having no transgression would be having no taboo. Because if there were no taboos, there'd be nothing to allow that damming up to occur to heighten the arousal. The fruit has to be forbidden in order for it to be appealing to us and create a lure, but not so forbidden that like you're never allowed to have it. That's when transgression degenerates into sin, and that's his critique of Christianity there. And also it's his critique of capitalist depravity. It's like sort of there's no real sacred function restored to these acts. They're just empty hedonistic acts, or something that's it's meant to be about making a profit. So like Roger Caillois talks about the importance of games as part of religious festivals, right? The Olympic Games, but all sorts of games. You know, you go to watch, say, the football grand final, and all you see is McDonald's ads, Hungry Jack's ads, KFC ads. It's like, this is not about the game. This is not about the gift of the body and the drive. It's about some horrible entity like gouging more money out of us, right? While polluting our brains with like garbage food and garbage ideology. You know, junk food's just the obvious one, but there's a lot of it going on, and that's the complaint about so-called transgressions under capitalism. It's not really about the gift, it's about exploiting the drive to make a profit in a way that harms us. So these transgressions have more in common with sin because of their degraded character than they do with the sacred transgressions that you got in a time where the body, the drives, were like seen as a gift, a divine gift from the gods, the divine animality. So no limits would be boring and would probably all die pretty quickly too. Yeah, like there's a natural limit to the drive in that, you know, we'll get into trouble if we don't know how to limit ourselves. We have taboos in order to survive, to meter it out, you know, when it's the right time, the kairos, you know, sophrosine, the right time to go, the right time to pull back, recover, reaccumulate our reserves work. Yeah, I think I got most of what came to mind during your interesting
Thank you.
comments.
I would have more, but I would also like to hear comments from
Okay, we'll maybe come back in at the end if we get
Hassan.
time. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Melinda.
you.
Thanks, Tim. That was so good. I had a thing I thought about with this idea of a perverse couple. And I'm thinking of cases where you've got a parent and a child. And it seems to me a little bit like the syndrome of Munchausen by proxy, where you've got a child that is made to be sick by someone that's in charge of their care. And it seems to me like a little bit like perversion by proxy. So you've got this parent who's got this kid that they won't let them separate, and they kind of insist on keeping this child stuck, almost like stuck to their body. And so it seems to me like the child is needing to separate, and their symptom, their perverse act, or I don't know if it's a structure or what it is, but it's trying to effect a way of separating from the parent. But it's like the child is playing out the perverse symptom of the parent in doing so. So, you know, it becomes a kind of a perverse couple in a way. I don't know, that's just from my observation, I guess. But I was thinking of that, and then I was thinking, is this, you know, can this be conceptualized as a kind of perversion? And if it could, where would it fit into your diagram that you showed before?
Yeah, I think there were a number of different ways where it could play out. So there's the sort of being the phallus and bearing the phallus sort of dyad, but then there's also identifying with the phallic mother as well, which can be also done in a number of different ways, like identifying with the mother as castrated or identifying with the mother as not castrated. For example, a subject whom I really enjoyed, transsexual women, a woman with a phallus, with an actual penis. It's been a category in pornography for decades, and it's actually getting more and more. It's actually getting better and better as stigma reduces. More mainstream performers are getting involved in it. The production looks a lot better. The health of the performers looks a lot better. But then there's also the man who wants to be the phallic woman themselves. So rather than taking the phallic mother as the object, they take the phallic mother as the subject. They become that phallic mother. And you saw that shifting around a little bit in Hans Baumer. So where does it fit? So I guess it fits all in that middle category I had going there with the perverse structure based on disavowal and fetishism. What's going on? Yeah. Oh, there we are. Sorry, I just lost vision for a second. So I got it up on screen. Was there a particular? So if you're asking like, oh, that's right, the perverse couple. So is the perverse couple the child and the mother? Then that would be that middle section, I think, typically the perverse structure.
We can't see the.
Okay, but maybe someone has it in mind. Yeah, but
Okay.
The perverse structure connected to disavowal of the mother's lack, so the child's still stuck to the body as the sort of mother's penis in some way, or else becomes the bearer of the phallus, but is so still cathected to the mother that there's no distance. They become a pervert in the sort of way of not having any limit to their jouissance through acting it out through the flasher Chris or this, the serial killer or any other sort of addictive kind of subjects. I don't know if that helps, Melinda.
Yeah, it does. I'm just wondering as well about the parents' perversion, what their parent, in that couple.
Yeah.
Where are they placed in that? Because they are keeping the child there. They're not allowed, so what is their perversion?
Yeah, so the mother could be like literally wanting a child to substitute for her own lack of a phallus. And so the child doesn't get its own space because you are not your own human being, you are my phallus. I am in control. When I wave, you shift left and right. But then there was the other example of the father who was too wild and erratic. So while he installed the initial cut of the incest taboo from the mother, he was such a dick that the child had to take refuge. And Freud uses that sort of example too, where the son has to take refuge with the mother to protect the child from the perverse father who's like acting out with aggression in a inconsistent way, which is what Zeus's mother did too, right? It's the whole thing about protecting the son from the father who swallows up his children. So that could be two examples of how perversity in the parents lead to a perverse trait in the child.
Thanks.
Perversity in the parent seems to be a really clear way to understand the intergenerational complexities that develop. Just seems to be striking in perversion in particular. So in the case you described, Melinda, that the mother, I think you said, or the parents anyway, that their situation is so clear, they're so overt, so obvious. It just seems to make the ramifications on the child more obvious than, say, in the little Hans case. It can be easy to overlook the mother, and Freud talks a lot about little Hans rather than the mother, so it's lost. I just noticed that perversion makes this clearer than in other structures.
Yes, I think that's what Lacan's sort of gambit of Seminar 4 was, in a way, to bring the case of the homosexual woman together with little Hans, to show how penicillin in the mother can, and where that comes from, really like kind of emphasizing the child phallus symbolic equation, where the case of the homosexual woman, it was that the father gave the mother another child instead of her. She was, wanting to get closer to her father, and said her mother won, that sort of mother-daughter rivalry. And so she starts, so she rejects the heterosexual position altogether. But there was pre-existing penicillin in her in the in her youth that also Freud draws out. And yeah, we'd have to know more about the mother again to sort of know how that led to the little girl responding in that way. But it's pretty bad if the mother is not letting the daughter develop sexually, instead trying to like cut her down to say, I'm still the top dog around here, I'm the prettiest one. It's the whole thing about not giving her space to become her own human being, to develop into her full bloom. So say, no, that threatens my ego. You can't be your own person, you have to be my appendage. And it's the appendage that makes me even more beautiful and more powerful than I was before. And of course, not to completely throw parents under the bus, because they got to look at the greater cultural reasons for this too, in that we've had no feminine deification in our religious structures for 2,000 years. There's no Persephone and Demeter festival. There's just the Mary and Jesus festival.
And those parents had parents too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a slow and patient work to try and improve the situation. Sandra,
I just well, that made me think about but still they're like they're outside. They're not the main hegemonic religion, but here in Mexico, we have a call to death, and death is like the holy death, and she's a feminine figure. So, but it's true that and I don't know. It's weird because here in Mexico, I mean, just commonly you would say we're colonized, right? Here in Mexico, and the coming of Christianity and everything. We actually had Virgin Mary imposed, and that helped in colonizing, because before that we did have or we, I mean, not me, obviously, but the native people here had also a motherly figure, which is the earth as well here, and there's also this structure of several gods, and we also had sacrifice, and I don't know. I just found it interesting, but it's all an effort to make a critique on Christianity and what it has done, right? That's the effort right now. And but yeah, I was also thinking about this, how we need the viewer, the recognition of the other is like I need the other to recognize, and I need to prop it up so there can be another, and then act out or have a structure or go on with the partial drive. I didn't quite get, but I'll review the partial drive parts later. I just wanted to say that it's about Belmer. I was trying to look for the whipped, because as you said, it's a combination of the feminine with the masculine. And he also worked with Unica Cern, and she was a writer. They had a relationship or something, and it reminded me of his photographic work with her. Was also like she would be in weird positions and creating like this weird forms, right? Which is the deformation of the or the metaphor for the deformation of penis, and how the woman form, the soft curves are marked and cut by the whipped, and this is and yeah, and I just wanted to show this nice drawing of Belmer, which is the story of the eye, but this is a very old, well, one of the first translations in Spanish, and but yeah, I was wondering about that necessity for recognition of the other being the observer, like, and this also reminds me to like, does art exist? Does the subject exist, or does something exist if there is no critique of it, right? If there is no judgment of like, I am because the other says that I am something. Is like what I'm trying to post here, and that is where it identifies with the phallic, or the symbolic register, the need for phallus, this necessity for not me or my own voice to tell me that I am whatever, but the other, like someone else, right? And so that I can, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the quality of the other. Like sometimes, and this is the paradox that Nietzsche worked with in his critique of Wagner. It's like social approval, if you're surrounded by idiots, is not a good thing. Social approval, if you are surrounded by people of quality, that kind of recognition is good. Or else it's like, if they didn't like it, that's the recognition I want. It means I'm doing something right, because I can see from the arguments and the evidence that they're in the wrong somehow, and it's my job to try and transform it. And the interesting thing about what what Bataille was trying to do with his recourse to surrealist modernism, if you like. He's sort of almost like continue the project of the Renaissance, going back to the ancient Greeks that Nietzsche was like big on, but going back even further to primitive culture itself by using his influences of psychoanalysis, Marcel Mauss, the French sociology, so that what was experienced in these archaic cultures, these archaic moments of the sacred, could perhaps to us become lucid in some way and sort of break through the kind of resistance that we have that's keeping this experience and the knowledge of the drives, knowledge of these experiences hidden from us. When it comes to Balmer, it's very interesting. Thanks for showing me that cover too. I hadn't actually seen his illustrations for Story of the Art. I think I'd seen Masson's illustrations. And I'm relying a lot on Michael Newman's. He's written a book on Balmer on his account, and the account given in the Perversion Now text. But at times Newell was quoting from Balmer himself, expressing the horror of the melting phallus or the disappearing phallus. So there's something of that initial castration fright in the discovery of difference that he's sort of knowingly playing with there as a sort of, it might be a perverse practice, but it's done through art, right? In a way that does achieve recognition. Balmer is, is considered a great artist and rightly so. But who knows? A lot of people around him might have thought he was strange and weird and borderline psychotic. So yeah, it's these are difficult questions, and we will continue to ponder them in the week after the break. We've reached past 9 o'clock. So thanks everybody for your attendance, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Tim.
Tim.
Thank you. Goodbye.